I hadn't heard that name in 23 years, not since the last person who used it walked out of my life without closing the door. So when the man behind me in the grocery store line said it, softly, almost like he was testing the sound of it, I felt something in my chest tighten in a way I didn't recognize at first. Lena. I froze with my hand still resting on the carton of eggs I hadn't placed on the counter yet. No one called me that anymore, not my coworkers, not my neighbors, not even my own son. To everyone else I was Melina, or Mrs. Carter when people wanted to be polite. Lena belonged to a different version of me, a younger one I had carefully folded away and stored somewhere deep enough that I wouldn't accidentally run into her on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I turned slowly. He wasn't smiling. That's what I noticed first. Most strangers who think they recognize you wear a kind of hopeful expression like they're about to reconnect a missing thread, but his face was still, almost careful. "Do I know you?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He studied me for a second longer than was comfortable, not in a rude way, just deliberate. "You used to," he said. There was something in the way he said it that made my fingers curl slightly against the egg carton. Not fear, not yet. Just a quiet, creeping awareness that something I had buried was about to be uncovered. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I said, turning back toward the cashier. It was easier to say that than to let my mind wander into places I had spent years avoiding. "Maybe," he replied, but he didn't move. I could feel him still standing there just behind my shoulder as the cashier scanned my items one by one. The soft beeping of the machine sounded louder than usual, or maybe everything else had just gone quiet. When I finished paying, I didn't look back again. I picked up my bags and walked out of the store, steady and composed like nothing had happened. But my hands were trembling by the time I reached my car. At 58, my life had settled into something predictable. Not exciting, not particularly remarkable, but stable. And after everything I had been through, stability had started to feel like a kind of quiet luxury. I lived alone in a small 2-bedroom house at the edge of town. The paint on the fence was starting to peel, and one of the kitchen cabinets didn't close properly unless you gave it a firm push, but it was mine. Every morning I woke up at the same time, 6:30. I would make coffee the same way I had for years, 2 spoons of ground beans, a little too much milk, no sugar. Then I would sit by the window and watch the street slowly come to life. Mrs. Delgado from across the road watering her plants. The school bus stopping at the corner, a man walking his dog, always at exactly 7:15. There was comfort in these small, repeated moments. They didn't ask anything from me. My son Daniel called me twice a week, Sundays and Wednesdays. He lived 3 hours away with his wife, Clara. They had been married for 8 years now, no children yet, though they said they weren't in a hurry. Our conversations were pleasant. We talked about the weather, his work, what I had cooked that week. Sometimes there were pauses that stretched a little too long, like both of us were aware of things we weren't saying, but neither of us pushed. We had learned over time to stay within the safe boundaries of what didn't hurt. I worked part-time at a local accounting office. Nothing demanding, just enough to keep my days structured. The people there were kind in a distant way. They knew I liked my tea at 11 and that I preferred quiet over conversation. And I knew just enough about their lives to ask the right questions without getting too involved. It was a life built on careful distances, and I had convinced myself that it was enough, that there was nothing left for me to discover. No surprises waiting around the corner, no unfinished chapters that could suddenly reopen. That was the lie I had been living with. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing his voice in my head. "Lena." It didn't sound accusing, it didn't sound warm either, just certain, as if he knew exactly who I was even if I refused to recognize him. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional car passing outside. There was a time when that name had been everywhere, in letters, in whispers. In arguments that lasted too long and apologies that came too late. I hadn't thought about those days in years, not properly. I had allowed them to blur at the edges, to fade into something distant and indistinct, because remembering clearly would have meant feeling everything again. And I wasn't sure I had the strength for that anymore. Around midnight, I got up and walked into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, but I didn't drink it right away. I just stood there holding it, staring at the reflection of my own face in the dark window. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before, a softness to my features that comes with time, but underneath all of that I could still see her. Lena. The version of me who had believed in things I no longer allowed myself to expect. I set the glass down on the counter. "You're imagining things," I murmured to myself. It was easier to believe that. Easier to think that the man in the store had simply mistaken me for someone else. That names can overlap, that coincidences happen, and that the past once buried stays buried. The next morning I tried to return to my routine: coffee, window, the slow unfolding of the day. But something had shifted. I found myself looking at people more closely when I stepped outside, at the man walking his dog, at the woman jogging past my house, as if I expected someone else to recognize me. As if I was waiting for that name to follow me out into the open. At work, I made a small mistake while reviewing a set of numbers. It was nothing serious, just a misplaced decimal, but it wasn't like me. "Everything okay?" my colleague Susan asked gently. I nodded too quickly. "Just didn't sleep well." She gave me a sympathetic smile and didn't press further. People rarely do when you've spent years showing them that you prefer silence. By the afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that I had overreacted, that the encounter meant nothing, that I could simply move on. But as I locked up the office and stepped out into the cool evening air, I saw him again. He was standing across the street, not approaching, not calling out, just there, waiting. And this time, when our eyes met, I didn't look away. Something in me knew that pretending any longer would only make it worse. I crossed the street slowly, my steps measured, my heartbeat steady but heavy. When I stopped in front of him, I noticed details I hadn't before: the lines on his face, the way his hands rested at his sides, slightly tense. He looked older than I remembered anyone looking in that part of my life, but there was something familiar in his eyes, something I couldn't place yet but couldn't ignore either. "You've been waiting," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded once. "I didn't want to startle you again." A faint, almost apologetic tone. I folded my arms lightly, not defensively, but enough to hold myself together. "You said I used to know you," I said. "So tell me." He took a small breath. And for a moment, I saw something shift in his expression. Not hesitation, not quite, more like the weight of a truth that had taken a long time to arrive. "You didn't just know me," he said quietly. "You trusted me." The words landed softly, but they carried something sharp beneath them, a memory pressing at the edges of my mind, unclear, unfinished. And then he said it. "Do you remember Thomas Reed?" The name didn't just return, it broke through. And in that instant, everything I had spent years trying not to remember began to move again. The name didn't settle gently. It hit me like something that had been locked behind a door suddenly forced open. Thomas Reed. For a moment, I didn't respond, not because I didn't remember, but because I remembered too well. The air between us felt different now, heavier, as if the past had stepped into the space with us and was waiting to be acknowledged. "I haven't heard that name in a long time," I said finally. My voice sounded steady, but it carried something underneath it, a quiet strain. He nodded like he expected that. I figured. I looked at him more carefully now, not just at his face but at the details I had overlooked before, the way he stood, slightly angled like he was ready to leave if I asked him to. The faint scar near his jawline, the eyes, that was where it stayed the longest, because there was something there I almost recognized. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to unsettle me. "Who are you?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a slow breath like he had been holding it for years. "My name is Sebastian," he said. "Sebastian Hale." The name didn't land the way Thomas Reed had. It didn't break anything open. But it didn't feel empty either. It hovered, waiting. "I'm sorry," I said, shaking my head slightly. You wouldn't remember me like that," he interrupted gently, not defensive, just certain, that same quiet certainty from the grocery store. "You knew me differently." There it was again. That feeling, like I was standing just outside of a memory I couldn't fully reach. I felt my fingers tighten slightly against my arms. "Then help me understand," I said, "because right now you're speaking in pieces." He glanced down for a moment, then back at me. "I was there," he said, "at the end." The words were simple, but they carried something heavy enough to make my chest tighten. The end. There are moments in life that you don't revisit because they don't sit quietly when you do. They rise, they speak. They remind you of who you were when everything fell apart. And I knew exactly which end he was talking about, or at least I thought I did. "You're going to have to be more specific," I said, though my voice had softened, because something inside me already knew. Sebastian studied me for a long second, not impatient, not pushing, just waiting for me to meet him halfway. You used to come to the lake, he said, and just like that, the memory shifted from distant to sharp. The lake, I hadn't thought about that place in years. Not properly, it had been where everything felt simple once, and where everything eventually unraveled. I went there a lot, I said carefully. That doesn't narrow it down. A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. No, he said, I guess it does. He took a small step closer, but not enough to crowd me. Thomas used to meet you there, he added. That did it. The ground beneath me felt steady, but something inside me tilted. I could see it now, clearer than I wanted to, the wooden dock. The quiet water stretching out into the distance. The way the evenings felt longer there, like time slowed down just enough for you to believe in things you shouldn't. And Thomas, always Thomas. You knew him? I asked. Sebastian nodded. I knew of him first, he said. Then, I knew both of you? There was something careful in the way he said that, like he was choosing each word with intention. I felt a small, familiar discomfort settle in my chest. Not fear, not exactly. More like the awareness that I was standing too close to something I had spent years avoiding. What do you want from me? I asked. It wasn't harsh, but it was direct, because I needed to understand why he was here, why now, after all this time. Sebastian didn't look surprised by the question. I wanted to talk to you, he said simply. About what? He hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw something I hadn't seen before, not confidence, not certainty, something closer to concern. About what happened, he said. I let out a small breath. That was a long time ago. Yes, he said, but not everything about it stayed in the past. That sentence didn't feel like a statement. It felt like a warning, or maybe a truth I hadn't allowed myself to consider. I shook my head slightly. I don't know what you think you remember, I said, but whatever it is, it's over. I could hear the firmness in my own voice now, the boundary I had built over the years rising back into place. I moved on. Sebastian's gaze didn't shift. I know you did, he said, and you had every right to. That caught me off guard. There was no accusation in his tone, no judgment, just acknowledgement, and somehow that made it harder to dismiss him. Then why are you here? I asked again, more quietly this time. He looked past me for a moment at the street behind us, then back at me. Because you didn't leave with the truth, he said. The words landed slowly, but they stayed. I felt something stir in my chest again. Something I didn't want to name yet. I think I know my own life, I said. You know what you were told, he replied gently, and what you believed. There was no force in his voice, no attempt to overpower me. And yet, the calmness of it made it harder to argue, because it didn't feel like he was trying to convince me of something false. It felt like he was asking me to reconsider something I had already accepted. I don't see the point in reopening old wounds, I said. Some wounds don't heal properly when the truth is missing, he said. That sentence sat between us. Quiet, unavoidable, I looked away for the first time, my gaze drifting toward the sidewalk. A memory flickered again, not clear, just a feeling, standing at the edge of something. Waiting for an answer that never came. You're asking me to go back to something I worked very hard to leave behind, I said. Sebastian nodded. I know, then you should also know why I wouldn't want to do that. I do, he said. And if I thought it would only bring you pain, I wouldn't be here. There it was again, that certainty, but now it felt different, less unsettling, more intentional. I looked at him again, really looked this time, not as a stranger, but as someone who had carried something long enough to come looking for me. What exactly are you saying? I asked. He held my gaze. That what you think happened isn't the full story. A silence followed, not empty, just full of everything I wasn't saying. Because the truth was, I had built my life on that version of events, on what I believed had happened, on what I had accepted even when it hurt. And if that wasn't the full story, then what had I been holding on to all these years? And you expect me to just believe you? I asked. No, he said. I expect you to listen. There was something steady in the way he said it, not demanding, not pleading, just offering. I exhaled slowly. The evening air felt cooler now. Or maybe it was just me. I don't have time for this today, I said after a moment. It wasn't entirely true, but it was what I needed to say, not yet, not all at once. Sebastian nodded. I understand. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He held it out to me but didn't step closer. My number, he said, in case you decide you want to hear the rest. I looked at the paper for a second before taking it. Our fingers didn't touch, but the space between them felt charged, I'm not promising anything, I said. I'm not asking for a promise, he replied, just the possibility. I folded the paper and slipped it into my bag. I'll think about it. He gave a small nod. That's all I can ask? For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I turned. And this time when I walked away, I didn't feel the same certainty I had felt the day before. Something had shifted, not fully, but enough. Because as I reached my car and sat down, my hand instinctively moved to my bag, to the small piece of paper inside. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a question I had buried long ago. What if I had been wrong? That night, I didn't try to convince myself it was nothing. I didn't dismiss it as coincidence. I sat at my kitchen table, the paper unfolded in front of me, staring at the number written in careful, deliberate handwriting. And I realized something I hadn't admitted before. Part of me wanted to know, not out of curiosity, but because something about the way he spoke felt honest. And that scared me more than anything else, because honesty has a way of changing things, even when you're not ready for it. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. And in the quiet of my kitchen, with only the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the past didn't feel as distant as it once had. It felt close, waiting. I didn't call him the next day or the day after that. I told myself I needed time, that I wasn't the kind of person who rushed into things, especially not something like this. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of what he might say. And even more afraid of what I might remember. Still, life doesn't pause just because you're trying to avoid something. It keeps moving, and somehow that made everything feel louder. The small things especially, the sound of the kettle boiling in the morning. The scrape of my chair against the kitchen floor, the quiet hum of the office printer. They all felt sharper, like my mind was trying to fill the silence with anything except the thoughts I was pushing away. By the third day, I found myself standing at the edge of the lake. I hadn't planned to go there, at least that's what I told myself, but my feet had brought me anyway. The path looked smaller than I remembered. The trees weren't as dense. Or maybe I had just grown used to seeing the world differently. Time does that. It changes the way places hold you. I stood there for a long moment looking out at the water. It was calm, still, the kind of stillness that used to make me feel at peace. Now it felt like something else, like it was holding on to things, memories that hadn't quite settled. I walked slowly toward the dock. It creaked under my weight just like it used to. That sound hadn't changed. And somehow that made everything else feel closer. I could almost see it. The younger version of me sitting at the edge, feet dangling just above the water. Waiting, always waiting. For him, Thomas Reed. I said his name quietly under my breath, not as a question, just to feel what it was like to say it again. It didn't feel foreign. But it didn't feel safe either. It carried too much, too many things left unfinished. You came back. The voice behind me was calm, familiar now. I didn't turn right away. I didn't tell you I would, I said. No, Sebastian replied, you didn't. I could hear his footsteps as he walked onto the dock, stopping a few feet behind me. He didn't come closer than that, and I appreciated it more than I expected to. I wasn't sure you'd decall, he added. I haven't, I said, not yet. A small pause settled between us, then I turned. He looked the same as he had a few days ago. But here, in this place, something about him fit differently, like he belonged in the edges of this memory I was trying to piece together. I needed to see this place first, I said. He nodded. That makes sense. We stood there for a moment, the water stretching quietly beside us. You said I didn't leave with the truth, I said finally. Sebastian didn't rush to answer. He looked out at the lake, his expression thoughtful. You left with what you were given, he said, and you made sense of it the best way you could. That sounds like a careful way of saying I was wrong. He glanced at me. I'm saying you didn't have all the pieces. I folded my arms more to steady myself than to close off. Then give them to me, I said. There was no sharpness in my voice, just readiness or something close to it. Sebastian exhaled slowly. It's not something I can explain in one sentence, he said. I'm not in a hurry. He gave a small nod, then he stepped a little closer, resting his hands lightly on the railing of the dock. Do you remember the last day you saw Thomas? He asked. The question settled heavily, because of course I did. Some memories don't fade, they just sit quietly until something brings them back. Yes, I said. Then you remember how it ended. I swallowed lightly. I remember what he said. And what he did. My jaw tightened slightly. Yes, Sebastian studied my face for a moment. Tell me, he said gently. I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because saying it out loud felt like reopening something I had sealed shut. He left, I said finally, without explaining anything. Sebastian didn't interrupt. He told me he couldn't do it anymore, I continued, that he needed something different. The words felt flat now, like they had lost their sharpest edges over time, but I could still feel the echo of what they had once meant. And then, Sebastian asked. I looked away out at the water, and then I found out he was already involved with someone else, I said. There it was, the version of the story I had lived with for years. Simple, painful, final. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, too quiet. I turned back toward him. You're going to tell me that's not what happened, I said. It wasn't a question, he didn't deny it, but he didn't agree either. I'm going to tell you that what you saw wasn't the whole truth, he said. I felt a small flicker of frustration rise. That's a very convenient thing to say after all this time. I know, he said calmly, and if I were in your place I'd feel the same way. I let out a quiet breath. Then say it clearly, I said. What exactly did I get wrong? Sebastian's gaze softened slightly. Not wrong, he said. Incomplete. That word again, careful, measured, almost too measured. I shook my head slightly. You're speaking like someone who's had years to think this through, I said. Because I have, he replied. And you expect me to just step into that? No, he said. I expect you to listen and decide for yourself. There was that steadiness again, not pushing, just present. I looked down at the wooden planks beneath my feet. There was a faint crack running through one of them. I didn't remember that being there before. But then again, time changes things, even the strongest surfaces. Start from the beginning, I said quietly. Sebastian nodded once. Then he shifted slightly as if grounding himself before speaking. I met Thomas before you did, he said. That caught my attention immediately. I looked up at him. What? He held my gaze. We worked together, he explained. Same firm, different departments. That wasn't something I had known, or if I had forgotten. He didn't talk much about his personal life back then, Sebastian continued. But when he met you, that changed. A faint memory stirred. Thomas, sitting across from me, smiling in that quiet way he had. He had always been reserved, careful with words. But with me, it had felt different. What do you mean? I asked. Sebastian's expression softened slightly. He was lighter, he said, more present. The words felt strange to hear because they didn't match the ending I remembered. And then, I asked. Sebastian's jaw tightened just slightly. Then things got complicated. I let out a small, humorless breath. That's one way to put it. He didn't react to that. He started pulling away, Sebastian continued. From work, from people. That part I remembered, the late replies, the canceled plans. The way his voice had changed just slightly, like he was carrying something he didn't want to share. I thought it was because of me, I said quietly. Sebastian shook his head. No, he said, it wasn't because of you. The certainty in his voice made something shift inside me, because that wasn't the story I had told myself. For years, I had believed that I had somehow not been enough, that he had found something or someone better. That's not what it looked like, I said. I know, Sebastian replied. And that's why I'm here. The words settled heavily between us, because for the first time I felt it, not just curiosity, not just doubt, something deeper. A crack in the certainty I had built my life on. If it wasn't because of me, I said slowly, then what was it? Sebastian looked at me, really looked this time, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't expected. Not just seriousness, but concern. Because he was already in trouble, he said. The words were quiet. But they didn't feel small. They felt like the beginning of something I hadn't been prepared for. Trouble? I repeated. The word felt too vague for something that had clearly stayed with him all these years. Sebastian nodded, but he didn't rush to explain. He seemed to be choosing his next words carefully, as if the way he said them mattered just as much as what he was about to reveal. What kind of trouble? I asked. My voice was steady, but inside something had already started to shift. Because if there was more to the story, then everything I thought I understood might not hold the same shape anymore. Sebastian rested his hands lightly on the dock railing, looking out over the water for a moment before speaking. Financial, at first, he said. But it didn't stay that simple. I frowned slightly. That doesn't make sense, I said. Thomas was careful, he didn't take risks like that. Sebastian glanced at me. You're right, he said. He wasn't reckless. There was a small pause. But he was trying to fix something, he added. The sentence hung there. I felt my chest tighten slightly. Fix what? Sebastian inhaled slowly. His father's debts. I blinked. That doesn't, I stopped myself because it did in a way. Thomas had rarely spoken about his family. Just brief mentions, a distant father, a strained relationship. Nothing detailed enough to build a full picture, but enough to suggest something unresolved. I didn't know anything about that, I said quietly. I know, Sebastian replied. He didn't want you to. Of course he didn't, that sounded like him. Always carrying things alone, always deciding what others should or shouldn't know. He got involved in something he thought he could manage, Sebastian continued. A short-term solution. I shook my head slightly. That sounds like a mistake he wouldn't make. Sebastian's expression softened, but there was something firm underneath it. People make different choices when they're trying to protect someone, he said. That landed deeper than I expected, because I understood that, more than I wanted to admit. What kind of solution? I asked. Sebastian hesitated for a brief moment, then he said it plainly. He borrowed money from the wrong people. The words didn't come with drama, no raised voice, no emphasis, and somehow that made them feel heavier. I let out a slow breath. That still doesn't explain what happened between us. It does, Sebastian said quietly. I looked at him, waiting. He couldn't keep up with the payments, Sebastian continued. Things started to escalate. A faint tension crept into his voice now, not fear but memory. They began to pressure him, he said. How? I asked. Sebastian met my eyes. By making it clear they knew about you. The air shifted, not dramatically, just enough to make everything feel sharper. My arms loosened slightly at my sides. What do you mean? I asked. They knew where you lived, he said, where you worked, your routine. I felt something cold move through my chest. That's not possible, I said quickly. It was, he replied, and Thomas knew it. I looked away, my gaze drifting back to the water. The calm surface didn't match what was building inside me. That doesn't explain why he left, I said. It does, Sebastian said again, more firmly this time. I turned back to him. He pushed you away, Sebastian continued. Deliberately. The word sat heavily. Deliberately. I felt my jaw tighten. That's not how it felt, I said. I know, he replied. It felt like abandonment. The accuracy of that word caught me off guard, because that was exactly what it had felt like, not confusion, not distance, but abandonment. He didn't explain anything, I said. He didn't give me a reason, because he thought the less you knew, the safer you'd be, Sebastian said. I let out a small, disbelieving breath. That's a very convenient excuse. Sebastian didn't react to the edge in my voice. I was there, he said. That made me pause. What do you mean? I was the one he talked to, Sebastian said, about all of it. The weight of that settled slowly. You, I asked. He nodded. He didn't want to involve you, Sebastian explained. But he needed someone to help him figure out what to do. I studied his face, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the story he was telling. And you're only telling me this now? I asked. There was no accusation in my tone. Just disbelief. Sebastian looked down briefly, then back at me. Because I didn't know where you were, he said, and by the time I did, everything had already fallen apart. A quiet silence followed, the kind that doesn't need to be filled right away. I folded my arms again, more loosely this time. Even if I believe that, I said slowly, it still doesn't explain what I saw. Sebastian's expression shifted slightly, more serious now. Tell me what you remember, he said. I hesitated. Because this was the piece I had held onto the most, the one that had made everything feel final. I saw him with her, I said. The words came out quieter than I expected. Who? Sebastian asked. I never knew her name, I said. But she wasn't just someone passing through. I could see it clearly, that day, that moment, the way everything had narrowed down to something I couldn't unsee. They were close, I continued. Too close. Sebastian didn't interrupt. He looked at her in a way he hadn't looked at me in weeks, I said. The memory still carried a dull ache, not sharp anymore, but present. And when I confronted him, I paused. He didn't deny it. That had been the worst part, not the sight. Not the realization, but the silence, the lack of explanation, the way he had simply accepted it. Sebastian's gaze didn't waver. I know who you're talking about, he said. I looked at him quickly. You do? He nodded. Her name was Melissa. The name meant nothing to me. But the way he said it made it feel significant. She wasn't what you thought, he added. I felt a flicker of frustration rise again. That's easy to say now. I'm not asking you to take it on faith, he said calmly. Then what are you asking? That you consider the possibility that what you saw was staged. The word hit harder than I expected. Staged, I repeated. Sebastian nodded. Thomas needed them to believe he had cut ties with you, he said, so he made it look real. I stared at him. That doesn't make sense, I said. It did to him, Sebastian replied. He thought if they believed he had moved on, they would leave you out of it. My mind struggled to catch up with what he was saying. You're telling me he pretended to be with someone else to protect me? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. I let out a breath that felt uneven. That's not something you can just fabricate, I said. No, Sebastian agreed, it is. Then how do I know you're not? He didn't look offended, he didn't look defensive. If I were lying, he said quietly, I would have told you something easier to believe. That stopped me because he was right. This wasn't easy to believe, it didn't simplify anything. It complicated everything. I looked down again, my thoughts moving faster now. If what he was saying was true, then the version of Thomas I had held onto all these years wasn't real. Not entirely. And neither was the version of myself who had accepted that ending. I need more than this, I said finally. Sebastian nodded. I know. He reached into his jacket again. This time when he pulled his hand out, he was holding something else. A small, worn envelope. He didn't hand it to me right away. Instead, he looked at it for a second, as if it carried more than just paper. He wrote this, Sebastian said. My breath caught slightly. When, I asked, before he disappeared. The word echoed, disappeared, not left, not moved on, disappeared. I looked at the envelope. My name was written on the front, not Melina, Lena. The handwriting was unmistakable. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for it. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not anger, not sadness, something quieter, something more uncertain. Hope. I didn't open the envelope right away. My fingers rested on it, tracing the edges as if I needed to confirm it was real before I dared to see what was inside. The paper felt fragile, not just from time, but from what it carried. I could feel Sebastian watching me, but he didn't speak. He gave me the space to decide, and I needed that. Because once I opened it, there would be no going back to the version of the story I had lived with for so long. Why didn't you give this to me before? I asked quietly. Sebastian exhaled. I didn't have it, he said, not until recently. I looked up at him. What do you mean? He left it with someone else, Sebastian explained, with instructions. A small pause. In case something happened to him. That settled heavily. What kind of something? I asked. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly. The kind he was trying to avoid, he said. That was enough to understand. I looked back down at the envelope. My name, his handwriting. A past I had sealed shut, now sitting in my hands like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Where did you get it? I asked. From his sister, Sebastian said. That surprised me. I didn't even know he had a sister. He didn't talk about her much, Sebastian said. They weren't close for a long time. Another piece I hadn't known, or maybe something I had never been allowed to know. He reconnected with her near the end, Sebastian added, near the end, that phrase again, careful, final. I swallowed lightly. And she just gave this to you? She didn't know where to find you, he said, but she knew I would try. I nodded slowly. That made sense in a way, or at least it fit with everything else he had been telling me. Still, there was a part of me that hesitated, not because I didn't want to know, but because I wasn't sure I was ready for what the truth might do to me. You don't have to read it now, Sebastian said gently. I shook my head. No, I said. If I wait any longer, I might not have the courage. My thumb slid under the edge of the envelope. The paper gave way easily, too easily, like it had been opened and closed too many times in someone else's hands. I pulled out the letter slowly. The fold was crisp, but the paper itself had softened with age. For a moment, I just held it there, unopened, because this was the line. The point where everything before and everything after would no longer be the same. Then I unfolded it. And I saw his handwriting again. The first line was simple. Lena. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not because I couldn't read it, but because seeing that name in his writing, it did something to me I wasn't prepared for. I opened my eyes again and kept reading. Lena, if you're reading this, then things didn't go the way I hoped they would. I don't know how much time has passed or where you are now. I don't even know if you'll ever forgive me for how I left things between us, but I need you to understand something even if it comes too late. My grip on the paper tightened slightly. The words were steady, measured, just like he used to be. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I didn't know how to keep you safe if I stayed. I felt my breath catch, just slightly, not enough to stop me, but enough to make each word feel heavier than the last. I made a mistake, Lena. One I thought I could fix before it touched anything else in my life, but it grew faster than I expected. And when I realized what it could do to you, I panicked. I could hear his voice in the words, not perfectly, but enough. You deserved honesty. You deserved the truth, but I chose silence because I thought it would protect you. I see now that silence can hurt just as much. A faint tremor moved through my fingers, because that part was true. It had hurt more than anything else. The woman you saw me with, her name is Melissa. I know what it looked like. I know what I made you believe. And I'm sorry for that in ways I don't know how to explain. I paused there just for a second. Because hearing her name again, now in his words, it made everything feel sharper, closer. She wasn't what you think. She was someone they trusted. Someone who could help make it look real. I needed them to believe I had moved on. That you were no longer part of my life. My eyes moved slower now, each line settling deeper than the last, because as long as they thought you mattered to me, you were in danger. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I know now that I didn't give you the chance to choose. I didn't trust you with the truth, and that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. The words blurred slightly for a moment, not from tears. Not yet, just from the weight of them. If things had been different, I would have stayed, I would have fought for us, but I didn't know how to do that without risking everything. A long pause, then the final lines, I don't expect you to understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope that one day you'll know that leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did, and that I never stopped thinking about you. Thomas, the silence that followed felt different, not empty, but full. Full of things I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I lowered the letter slowly. My hands were steady, but something inside me was. For so long, I had carried a version of that ending, a clean break, a betrayal I could define. Something I could place blame on even if it hurt. But this didn't fit neatly into anything. It didn't erase the pain, but it changed its shape. You see now, Sebastian said quietly. I didn't respond right away because I was still trying to understand what I was seeing. What I was feeling. What happened to him? I asked finally. My voice was softer now, less guarded. Sebastian didn't answer immediately, and that told me more than words would have. I looked up at him. Sebastian. He met my gaze. And in his eyes I saw it, not uncertainty, not hesitation, something heavier, something final. He didn't make it out of it, he said. The words were calm, but they didn't feel gentle. They landed, deep. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the letter. What do you mean? I asked. Sebastian held my gaze. He disappeared not long after that, he said. They found his car. A pause, but not him. The world didn't tilt, it didn't collapse, it just shifted. Quietly, irreversibly, I looked back down at the letter in my hands. At the handwriting I had just reconnected with, and for the first time I realized something I hadn't considered before. I had never truly said goodbye. I didn't cry at the lake, not then. Not while Sebastian stood beside me, not while the letter rested in my hands like something fragile and irreversible. Instead, I folded it carefully, too carefully, as if neatness could somehow contain what I was feeling. I thought he left, I said quietly. Sebastian didn't respond right away. Because there was nothing to correct anymore. I built my life around that, I continued. Around the idea that he chose to walk away. The words didn't sound bitter, they sounded tired, like something I had repeated so many times it had lost its sharpness. Sebastian nodded slightly. I know, I looked at him. You knew this whole time? No, he said, not everything. A pause, but enough. I let out a slow breath and slipped the letter back into the envelope. And you just carried this? I asked. He gave a small, almost uncertain shrug. I didn't know where to find you, he said again, and by the time I did, I wasn't sure if it would help or hurt. It did both, I said honestly. That seemed to settle something in him, not relief, but acceptance. We stood there for a moment longer. The lake stretched out in front of us, quiet and unchanged, but something had shifted too deeply for that. I need to go, I said finally. Sebastian nodded. I understand. I turned and walked back toward the path, the envelope held firmly in my hand. This time I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was carrying something forward. That night I didn't sit at the kitchen table. I didn't try to distract myself with routine. I went straight to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, the envelope resting in my lap. The house felt different, not unfamiliar, just aware, like the walls had been holding on to something I had never fully acknowledged. I opened the envelope again, not to reread the letter, but just to look at it, to remind myself it was real. For years, I had told myself a story, a simple one: he left. He chose someone else, he didn't love me enough to stay. It had been painful. But it had also been complete. There were no loose ends, no questions left unanswered. That kind of pain, at least, you can eventually learn to live with, but this was different. This was unfinished, and somehow that made it harder. I leaned back slowly, my head resting against the couch. The ceiling above me looked exactly the same as it always had, but my thoughts didn't. They moved differently now, slower, deeper. I thought about the last time I had seen him. Not the version I had repeated in my mind, but the actual moment, the details I had ignored, the things that hadn't fit neatly into the story I had chosen to believe, the way his voice had sounded, not distant, not cold, just strained. The way he had avoided my eyes, not out of indifference, but something else, something I hadn't wanted to understand at the time, because understanding would have required me to ask questions, and I hadn't. I had reacted, I had assumed. I had walked away with my own version of the truth, and I had never looked back, until now. I sat up slowly, the envelope still in my hand, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to consider something I had never fully faced. I hadn't just been hurt, I had been wronged, not completely, but enough. And that realization didn't come with relief, it came with something heavier: responsibility. The next morning I didn't follow my usual routine. I didn't make coffee right away. I didn't sit by the window. Instead, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. Then, without overthinking it, I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. Then I dialed. It rang twice before he answered. "Hello?" His voice sounded the same, steady. "Present, it's me," I said, a brief pause. "I was hoping you'd call," Sebastian replied. "I have questions." "I figured you would." I took a small breath. "I don't want pieces anymore," I said. "I want everything you know." There was no hesitation this time. "All right," he said. "Can you meet today?" I asked. "Yes." We agreed on a small cafe not far from my house, neutral, quiet, a place where conversations could happen without interruption. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a table near the window. 2 cups of coffee in front of him. I noticed that immediately. "You remembered," I said as I sat down. "A little too much milk," he replied. For the first time, there was something almost warm in his tone, not light but familiar. I wrapped my hands around the cup. It was still warm. "I need you to tell me what happened after he wrote that letter," I said. Sebastian nodded. "He tried to fix things," he said. "That's what he had been doing all along." "How?" "By paying off what he owed," Sebastian replied. "By cutting ties." I frowned slightly. "And did it work?" Sebastian's expression shifted, not quite regret but close. "For a while," he said. "I felt my chest tighten again. And then, they didn't let him go," Sebastian said simply. The words felt final. "Why?" I asked. "Because by then, it wasn't just about money anymore." I leaned forward slightly. "Then what was it about?" Sebastian met my gaze. "Control," he said. That word settled heavily. "They wanted to make an example out of him," he continued, "to show that walking away wasn't an option." A quiet chill moved through me. "And you?" I asked. "Where were you in all of this?" "I tried to help him," Sebastian said, "but there was only so much I could do." His voice didn't carry guilt, but it carried something else: limits. "And the letter?" I asked. "Why didn't he give it to me himself?" Sebastian looked down briefly. "Because by the time he wrote it, he already knew he might not get the chance." The honesty of that didn't feel cruel, it felt necessary. I looked down at my hands, at the faint lines that time had left behind. "And no one ever found him?" I asked. Sebastian shook his head. "No." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was full of everything that had never been said. Everything that had never been understood. "I spent years thinking he didn't care," I said quietly. Sebastian didn't interrupt. "I told myself that was the only explanation," I continued. "That it was easier for him to leave than to stay." I looked up at him. "And now you're telling me he stayed in the only way he thought he could?" Sebastian nodded. "Yes." I leaned back slowly. The coffee in front of me had gone untouched. I didn't even remember lifting it. "I don't know what to do with this," I admitted. That was the truth, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just honest. Sebastian's expression softened slightly. You don't have to do anything with it right away, he said. Some truths take time to settle. I nodded. That felt right, not comforting, but real. I keep thinking about the way I left that day, I said. The things I said. Sebastian watched me quietly. I didn't give him a chance to explain, I added. You reacted to what you saw, he said gently. I judged him, I said. You protected yourself, he corrected. I shook my head slightly. Maybe, I said, but I also closed a door that maybe shouldn't have been closed so quickly. The words felt heavy, but necessary. Sebastian didn't argue, because some things don't need to be softened, they just need to be acknowledged. When I left the cafe, I didn't feel lighter, but I felt clearer. And sometimes clarity is more important than comfort. Clarity has a quiet way of rearranging things. It doesn't rush in like a storm, it settles slowly, and once it does, you start to see everything differently. That evening, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove without a clear direction at first, letting the roads decide for me, past familiar streets, past places I had walked by for years without really seeing them. Until I found myself parked outside my own house, the engine still running, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. For a long moment, I didn't move, because I knew something had shifted inside me, not just in how I saw Thomas, but in how I saw myself. For years, I had told a story that made sense. A story where I had been left behind. A story where I had been the one who had to pick up the pieces alone. And while that part was still true, it wasn't the whole truth anymore. I had also been someone who walked away without asking enough questions. Someone who chose certainty over complexity. And now, sitting there in the quiet hum of the car, I realized something that was harder to accept than anything Sebastian had told me. I had forgiven him for leaving. But I had never examined my own leaving. The next few days were different, not in a dramatic way. Nothing around me changed. The same routines were there, the same quiet mornings, the same familiar faces, but inside things felt unsettled. Like something had been moved and hadn't quite found its place again. At work, I caught myself staring at the same page longer than necessary. At home, I would begin simple tasks and forget what I had intended to do halfway through. Even my conversations with Daniel felt slightly off. Not because anything was wrong, but because I was more aware now of the things I wasn't saying. On Wednesday, when he called, I answered on the second ring. Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart. His voice was warm, familiar, grounding. How's your week been? He asked. Quiet, I said. It wasn't a lie, just not complete. We spoke about the usual things. His work, Clara's new project, the neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop barking. Simple, safe topics. But halfway through the conversation, I found myself hesitating. There was something I wanted to say. Something I had never said before, not to him, not to anyone. Daniel, I said slowly, do you remember much about when I was younger? There was a small pause on the other end. Some things, he said. Why? I leaned back in my chair. The kitchen felt quieter than usual. Do you remember Thomas? I asked. Another pause, longer this time. I remember the name, he said carefully. You don't talk about him. I know, that had been intentional. I had kept that part of my life separate, tucked away. I ran into someone who knew him, I said. Daniel didn't interrupt. I found out things I didn't know before, I added. What kind of things? He asked. His voice was still calm, but there was curiosity now and something else. Concern, maybe. The kind that changes how you see the past, I said. That was the best way I could put it. There was a quiet exhale on the other end. Is that good or bad? He asked. I thought about that carefully. It's honest, I said, and sometimes that's both. He didn't respond right away, then he said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. You always told me that the truth matters more than comfort, he said. I did. Then I guess this is just you following your own advice. I smiled faintly. Even though he couldn't see it, maybe it is. We spoke a little longer after that about small things again, but something in that conversation felt different, more open, more real, and when we hung up, I didn't feel the same quiet distance that usually followed. I felt connected. A few days later, I went back to the lake, not because I needed answers this time, but because I needed closure, not the kind that ties everything neatly together, but the kind that allows you to stand still without feeling like something is missing. The weather was cooler. The air carried a faint scent of damp leaves. I walked the same path, stepped onto the same dock, but I didn't stand at the edge this time. I sat down, slowly, carefully. like I was allowing myself to be present in a place I had once only associated with waiting. I took the letter out again, not to analyze it, not to search for meaning, but simply to read it as it was, a final message. From someone who had tried in his own flawed way to protect what he loved. I read it once, then folded it again, and this time when I held it in my hands, it didn't feel like something unfinished. It felt complete, not perfect, not painless, but complete enough. I understand, I said quietly, not to the water, not to the silence, but to him, to the version of him I had carried for so long, and to the version I had just discovered. Both of them, for the first time, they didn't feel like contradictions. They felt like parts of the same story. I heard footsteps behind me again, but this time I didn't tense. I wasn't sure you'd come back, Sebastian said. I wasn't sure either, I replied. He walked onto the dock and stood beside me, not too close, just enough. I think I needed this, I said. He nodded. Most people do. I looked out at the water. It's strange, I said. For years I thought closure meant getting answers. And now, he asked. Now I think it means accepting the answers you get even if they're not the ones you expected. Sebastian considered that. That sounds about right. I smiled faintly. I spent so long being certain about something that wasn't entirely true, I said. That happens more often than people admit, he replied. I glanced at him. And you, I asked, why did you really come looking for me? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I didn't think it was fair for you to carry the wrong version of that story for the rest of your life. I studied him, and now, he gave a small shrug. Now it's yours to carry however you choose. That felt respectful. Not intrusive, not controlling, just honest. I'm glad you found me, I said. The words came naturally, without hesitation. Sebastian nodded once. Me too. We stood there for a while longer, not speaking, just existing in the same space. And for the first time since all of this began, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. That night when I returned home, I didn't leave the letter on the table. I didn't tuck it away in a drawer either. I placed it in a small box I kept in my bedroom, a box filled with things I had chosen to keep. Not because they were perfect, but because they mattered. And as I closed the lid, I realized something simple. The past hadn't changed. But my understanding of it had. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.